So this session is on back to basics, what I call back to basics session. And today we will be focusing on writing your resume and your cover letters. So before we start, I want to acknowledge the land that Vic College is on. So we wish to acknowledge that this land, so Vic, which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunities to work on this land. And I think it's particularly important when we talk about resumes and cover letters, we're telling a story about ourselves. So when we think about the Indigenous populations and communities that make up this country, who were here before we have been, knowing sort of what kind of stories are being told about the land, what kind of stories are being told about those communities and those populations, those groups, and how can we ensure that it is Indigenous people that are able to tell their own story rather than have someone else tell their story. Especially important when we talk about resumes and cover letters, because when you talk about telling your story, you want to be the one driving that narrative and not anyone else. So just something to keep in mind, especially when we talk about reconciliation and trying to right the wrongs of the historic wrongs in this country. So before we start, I just wanted to get a sense, how confident are you about writing resumes and cover letters? So I put a poll up on Zoom, so feel free to enter your answers or whatever. Okay, so let's see if I can share the results. So no one's feeling very confident or confident. So most people are either somewhat confident or not at all confident. So it's good. It's a great place to start. And hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be feeling more confident to tackling on writing a more effective resume and cover letter. So what we'll be learning today is getting an understanding of the format of how to write your resume and cover letter specifically for Canadian and American environment. I will say that if you are applying for jobs elsewhere in the world, those can look really different. So some countries, for instance, they'll want to have a photo of you, but here in Canada, that's not a thing that people really want to see on a resume. So just know that what we'll be talking about today is more primarily on Canadian and American environments. We'll also be talking about how to reframe your volunteer, education, internships, leadership, teamwork, and paid work, and all other types of experiences into part of forming a cohesive career narrative. Also talking about how to gain confidence in telling your story through your resume and cover letter. And as I mentioned earlier before, talking about the results and the accomplishments that you gained through those experiences. And then lastly, focusing on sharing your resume and accomplishments, what I just mentioned. So before you even write a resume and a cover letter, if you do have a job in mind, first thing to do is start with a job posting, because the job posting will sort of highlight those key skills that they're looking for. And generally, these are skills that are mentioned at the beginning of the posting. So when they talk about sort of what the job posting is about, what kind of skills they want, the skills and the phrases that come up in the beginning of the posting, that will be the ones that they're the ones that likely are the ones that they want from a candidate. So you want to be able to notice what those key skills are and to be able to match your experiences with those key skills. And if you notice that some of them might be strengths, so if they talk about communication skills and you have really strong communication skills, great. So notice that as a strength and be able to highlight that on your resume and your cover letter. But you've also noticed that there have some skills that they highlight, but you don't really have those skills, be able to be aware of what those gaps are and to find ways to try to fill those gaps. So one way to sort of analyze those job postings is what we call a T-chart analysis. So the left side is sort of the relevant skills you picked out from the job posting, and the right side is the experiences you have that match with those key skills. So for instance, one of those key skills for here, like teamwork, and then your experience could be working at USAC. You worked alongside 3 other executives along with 25 student members to deliver engaging programming and services for over 3,000 undergraduate students, for instance. So why don't we just do a quick practice with the people here. So this is a sample job posting that I took from CLNX. So take a read over this quickly and let me know what kind of key skills do you notice here in this posting. So Lubna, communication skills in English, for sure, yeah. So they talk about excellent written and verbal communication skills. Yep, one, so knowing that French and Spanish are assets. So knowing that these are assets, being, if you know French or Spanish, it's important to be able to talk about that in your resume and in your cover letter. Interpreting data for sure. Strong team player, yep. Organization, being able to use Microsoft products. Yeah. The one thing I will say with the Microsoft Office product is it's not something that you really need to, like that likely won't be a key message because at this point, a lot of people know how to use, hopefully know how to use Microsoft products or Word documents or making slideshows and whatnot. So it might be something you want to add on to a bullet point in your resume, but not something that you want to highlight as like the top key message you have for that or for that employer. And then moving on, strong adaptability, being able to work remotely. So for sure. And that's something with the pandemic, all of us are working remotely at some level. So something you can definitely highlight as well. And that also links back to communication skills. So how do you communicate virtually online in a remote environment? So great. So all picked up some really great key skills. So when you write those resume and write that cover letter, you want to keep those key skills in mind because you want to mention them in your resume and in your cover letter. All right, so let's start with resumes. So just some basic things to keep in mind. So what to do and things to keep in mind. So generally it's 1 to 2 pages maximum, depending on the field and depending on your experience. If you're just starting out in terms of, just say you're first or second year student, you may want to stick to 1 page. If you have a lot more experiences, so you're third, fourth year, maybe just really active outside of classes, then you could go to 2 pages. The other thing to keep in mind is the field that you're in. So depending on the field, they may prefer 1 page. So if you're in the tech industry, for example, they generally prefer 1 page. So keeping in mind and be able to ask professionals in the field and getting a sense of what people in your field prefer for a length of resume. If you have 2 pages, number them. So number them like page 1 of 2 or page 2 of 2, just so people know that there's 2 pages for resume in case they lose one of the pages. You also want to make sure that it is unique to each job. So I think Lubna mentioned before that you need to tailor the resume. So you have to tailor the resume to each job that you apply for. And this is where we talked about the analysis of the job posting comes into play because each job will require different skill sets. So when you know those skills based on your analysis, you can then tailor your resume to highlight those key skills. Generally, you have contact information at the top of the page and with your name that is prominently on there. So make sure your name is big so they know who it is. You want to have consistent formatting throughout. So for instance, if you want to have all your dates on one side, great. Just make sure that every date that you have on there is on the right side of the resume. You don't have them all over the place. This is because it makes it easier to read and scan. So when you have employers that want to be able to scan your resume easily, so for instance, when they want to get a sense of how long you've been working, they want to be able to see your dates all on one side and be able to sort of mentally calculate how long you've been working for the specific job, or maybe in general, what is your work experience like. The font generally should be 11 or higher. If you go for 10, it gets a little small. So you want it to be not too big that you can't put enough stuff in there, but you also don't want to be too small because nobody wants to read tiny text. Also using bullet points is important. So avoid writing paragraphs because it can be a lot for someone to read. And I would say mentally, it can be daunting seeing a paragraph. Whereas if you see a bullet point, it's more easy to digest because you can go from bullet point to bullet point. So using bullet points makes it easier to read. And also including recent experiences. So within the last 5 years, it depends. If you've done something really, really innovative or really impressive or really, really strong or really highlights a really key accomplishment that happens before, like maybe beyond 5 years, then you could include it. But just know that if you have more recent experiences that are equally impressive or more impressive, highlight those things. So for instance, high school might be something you want to mention, but if it's something that's pretty minor, then you may want to keep that off the resume and instead have something that's more recent on there instead. When we think about experiences, it can be anything. So it could be stuff that you've done in classes, it could be volunteering, it could be work, it could be personal projects, it could be club engagement. So generally, a lot of things could be on here. So the question is, rather than what do I put in, it's more like what do you want to take out? So assume everything can be on the resume and then get a sense of what you can take in order to keep it down to the page or two, and also making sure that each experiences that they target those key skills that you mentioned, but that you were able to analyze from the job posting. Some other things to keep in mind. So no need for an objective. Sometimes I see the objective on a resume. It's not really that useful because the objective is essentially you want to get a job, which isn't really any different from anybody else. So generally what we suggest for the first section of the resume is something we call a summary of qualifications. I'll talk about that later. Also photos, don't need a photo for there. You also don't want to provide too much personal information. So even things like gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, cultural background, you don't need to include that kind of stuff. And also there are laws in Canada that there's some things that employers cannot ask you. So making sure that you don't provide that information willingly. You also don't need to provide names of your former work supervisors. Any old relevant experiences, don't need to mention that as well. So for example, if you volunteered at a marathon like 10 years ago and you handed out water bottles to people, that may not be the most relevant experience for a lot of jobs. So just keeping that in mind. If you have references, don't need to put them in there. If they ask you for an interview, that's when you provide the references. So even the phrase references upon request, no need to add that because that's assumed already. Also don't need to use student IDs because they're not going to know what those numbers are, because they don't, for a lot of employers, they're not going to know a U of T ID versus another person's student ID. So if you're using color, great. Keep it simple though. Don't use too many colors. Also making sure that you have enough space and margins. So you don't want to be too compact that it becomes too overwhelming. So making sure that you have enough space between sections and also have good margins around so it doesn't become too overwhelming. Lastly, two more things. So spelling and grammar, really important. So similar to when you write papers and essays for your classes, make sure you watch your spelling and grammar. Pratham, so asking how can we access the recording? So the recording for this session, it will be posted on Quarkus. It might take a couple weeks, but we'll send you information once we have the recording available. So, and the last thing, so when you have a resume, keeping in mind that employers generally will not spend 5 minutes reading your resume. They may spend, I would say, average 10 seconds, maybe 60 seconds if they're really generous, but you have 10 seconds. So you want to make sure that your resume is easily scannable and it looks impressive based on a 10-second look at that resume. So it could be making sure that you have those keywords, making sure that it's labeled properly and that the sections are clear and bolded fonts so it's easier to read. So keeping that in mind. So there's generally two main formats. So there's chronological on the left side here and then functional on the right side. So generally chronological is going to be based on their most recent experiences, and then it goes from most recent to the older experiences. Functional will be more focused on skills. And then you have the list of experiences at the bottom. So for the chronological generally is the more preferred version, the more preferred format, because it is easier to read. But you're finding that you don't have enough experience, or your experiences don't quite seem that impressive, you can use a functional one, which focuses more on skills rather than the work history. So Gavin, a question. So it's better to include and focus on what they require than trying to include as much as possible and show everything that what you have done. So yes, so definitely be selective on what you include. Don't include everything because that's going to be too much. So you want to be able to include experiences that sort of talk about those key skills that you identified earlier when you looked at the job posting. Also keeping in mind for a resume, you have a page or two, so you don't want to be providing too much information that then puts you over those page limits. So, all right. So some common resume sections. So I'll talk about the summary qualifications after this, but it's generally like an abstract for your resume. It gives a broad overview of who you are as a person. Next, you have experiences. So generally some people, they break it down in terms of work experience and then volunteer experience. I would say it's better to talk about, highlight those key skills instead and put your volunteering and paid work and all the other stuff together rather than separating them out, because you want them to sort of show them that you have, for example, teamwork experience. So if you look at the job posting and they talk about teamwork, which was mentioned for the job posting that we saw earlier, one of them was teamwork experience. Another one could be communication experience, or it could be experience analyzing data. So finding those really top 2 or 3 key skills and have those be the headers for experience is important because they know right away that under this section, these are all your teamwork experiences entries. So that way they can sort of know that when they read this section, they can focus on that teamwork aspect. Next, your education. So that's important. I would say for education, generally, you can put that at the bottom of the resume, unless you're applying for grad school. I would say because your education generally isn't the most unique thing about you because there are a lot of students out there and there's a lot of U of T students. So what's going to set you apart isn't necessarily your degree, but it's likely going to be your experiences. So keeping that in mind, especially when you look at a resume, that first page is really important. So I want to make sure that the first page is impressive and unique by itself. If you want any awards or scholarships, feel free to put that in there as well. If you have any skills, especially if you're in the tech industry, thinking about programming languages that you know, coding, software that you know as well. You can also talk about language that you know. So in terms of French or Spanish, if you're fluent in those, feel free to mention that. If you have any professional development, so any courses you've taken outside of school, I think you can also mention that. That might not be as relevant for students. There's also certifications and licensing. So if you're part of your professional association, that might be important. I'm a social worker, so I generally put in the fact that I am a registered social worker on my resume. And then some other sections that you could add, so professional associations, memberships, especially if it's a industry that really values that kind of membership stuff, then you could mention that as well. And for some jobs, you may want to add hobbies or interests, but that one's optional, depending on the job. So if you're applying to work in a company that really focuses on outdoor active lifestyles, you could mention that your interest is in snowboarding and hiking or whatnot, just to show that you're a good fit for that company. But it depends on the job posting, and also depends on the employer. So the summary section, that's generally at the beginning of the resume, and it's 3 to 5 bullet points to highlight some key skills that you really want them to know. And as I mentioned before, it's an abstract for your resume. So you want to highlight the top skills that they mentioned in the job posting. So if the posting that really emphasizes teamwork, then you want one of those bullet points to be about teamwork. And generally, if you can, try to quantify that experience. So you can say something like 2+ years of teamwork working in this, and that. And the great thing about this summary section is you're able to combine your experiences across all of your work history, volunteering, club engagement together. Because when you look at the experiences, each of those experiences are segregated and siloed from each other. But in this section, you're able to actually combine all of it into one. So it's a great way to summarize all your experiences and to be able to show and highlight how many years of experience you have in doing this kind of work and or that kind of work. So talking about those key skills, those key achievements, especially if you have a really impressive accomplishment, you can mention that here. You can also talk about personal characteristics. So in terms of things like being able to speak multiple languages, that could be something you can mention as well. So the main thing you should think about when you write this section is focus on why you are a good candidate for this particular position. So when we talk about the resume being tailored, this is one way to really make sure that you tailor your resume to the job posting, because you highlight those key skills that's mentioned in the posting. So these are some examples of things you could put. So the first one talks about the experience. So 2 years experience working with children and delivering arts-based education. The second one talks more about the skills. So demonstrated skill in developing, facilitating, and assessing. There's an error there, but demonstrating skill in developing, facilitating, assessing, supervising, and modifying exercises for children and adults. And the last one on sort of the skill, your language ability. So fluent in speaking and writing professionally in Cantonese and Mandarin. So these are some examples you could add based on different experiences. So for all of you, it'll be different based on your own experience. Next, I'm going to talk about accomplishment statements. So when you write those bullet points for each of those experiences, you want to be able to talk about the results or the impact of your experiences, because this is what will set you apart. And when possible, you want to quantify your work. So that could be in terms of talking about sale targets. So if you're part of a fundraising team, talking about how much money you raised. If you were part of helping to organize an event, talking about how many people attended that event. If you're involved in communications and marketing, talking about sort of the metrics of how many people followed you on Instagram, how many people viewed your posts, how many people shared your posts. So things like that, talking about the impact is really important. And there's a formula here called STAR. So situation, task, action, and results. So situation talks about the background. Task is about responsibility. So what you are responsible for in that position. Action talks about what you actually did. And the key one is result, which is your impact. I put task in parentheses because it can be difficult trying to discern situation, task, and action at times. So the main thing is to know that generally people talk about the situation, task, and action pretty well because that's basically what you did. The thing that I find a lot of people have difficulties is with the results. So talking about your impact or why you did what you did. It essentially answers the question, why should I care that you did this duty or why should I care that you did this task? So when you talk about the result, it actually shows what impact you have and why you are an impressive candidate. Okay, so these are some examples. And you can see that these are all for the same experience, but they have different focuses. So for instance, sales experience. So this is someone who worked at the varsity football games and the part of their sales team, I guess. So the first one talks about sold tickets for 50-50 raffle draws at varsity football games, raising $2,000 over the season to allow for the purchase of 30 team jerseys. So you can see here that they quantified their work, they quantified the impact that they made so that they were able to raise $2,000. And because of that, they were able to purchase 30 team jerseys. So that talks about the impact and the accomplishments that they had. Because anyone could say that they sold tickets for 50-50 raffle draws. Like I could say that, but that could mean that I just sold one ticket and that was literally useless. Whereas this person sold $2,000 worth of tickets that was able to then purchase some jerseys. The next one talks about leadership experience. So coordinated a team of 5 volunteers, including hiring, training, and supervising to ensure all raffle sales targets were met. So this one talks about being able to manage a team, coordinate, and work with a team of 5 people. And because of you were able to ensure that you were able to meet those raffle sales targets. And the last one is about project management experience. So develop a project plan that outlines the project scope, key dates, and success metrics resulting in exceeding raffle sales target before the deadline. So again, the result here is being able to meet those sales target before the target date. So again, talking about those results, those impact, and those accomplishments, and that will set you apart on your resume and also on your cover letter. Okay, so the last slide I'll show you before I put you into your breakout groups is the slide of action verbs. So when you start your bullet points, you always want to start with the strong action verb. So sometimes I see on resumes, people start off with responsible for this or worked on that. But when you talk about responsible for, it's not a really strong word, especially when that first word is really important on a resume, because when employers look at your experiences, they look at those key action verbs first. And if they see a action verb that aligns with the skills that they want in the job, they're more likely to read it. So for instance, before example, that example job posting, one of the key skills was teamwork. If you talk about something like collaborated as a key action verb that you put on your resume, they're more likely to go, oh, collaboration, that is something I need for this job because I'm really wanting someone who's able to work in a team. So being able to talk about collaboration is key. You can also talk about, so under, for example, in this table, communication people skills, being able to say like mediated, negotiated, proposed, persuaded, all these sort of key verbs touch on those skills that would be required for that job posting. So whenever you start off a bullet point on your resume, make sure you pick strong action verbs that represent the skills that you want them to know about you. I'll also send out some websites that has all these different action verbs. There's many of them. So don't feel like you have to come up with those words on your own, because there are lots of websites that will have hundreds of these words on there. So So next we'll talk about cover letters. It's going to be pretty similar to resumes, especially around the result piece. So the basics of the cover letter here is it's a place where you have more room to tell your story and it complements your resume. So you don't want to be repeating what's on your resume. You will mention stuff that it is on your resume, but it's an opportunity for you to tell a more cohesive, a more longer story about your experiences. So similar to the resume, you want to talk about those key skills that were mentioned in the job posting that you analyzed. You want the cover letter to be unique to each job, similar to a resume. It should be a business letter format, so date on the top left. You want to use your name whenever possible. So rather than saying, dear hiring manager, you want to say, dear Susan Lee or dear Joe Patrick or whatever the name is, making sure that if you're able to identify the person who will be looking at your application. And also closing professionally. So don't say cheers or see you later. You want to use professional words like sincerely, best regards. You also want to use the same header on your resume as your resume on your cover letter. So having that similar header provides basically, it indicates to them that this is a complete application. And lastly, again, similar to resume, knowing your spelling and grammar is really important. So generally there's two kinds of ways to go about writing a cover letter. The first one is around skills. The second one's around experience. So introduction, you want to talk about the organization a bit, do your research, figure out why you want to work for that company or that organization and match sort of their values, what they do to why you want to work for them. Then you can either talk about the skills or talk about the experiences. So the skills, you sort of highlight 2 or 3 key skills you want to be able to share. And in those skills paragraphs, you highlight experiences that reflect those skills. In the experiences, you talk about one experience and then talk about what skills emerge from that one experience. So depending on which one you want to feel more comfortable with, you can either start with skills first or experience first. Either way, you'll still be talking about your skills and your experience together. And lastly, you conclude. So again, you want to remind them why you are a good candidate for the position, reiterate those key skills, and then basically ask for an interview or saying that you look forward to an interview in the future. All right. So this is an example of a cover letter paragraph. So we talked about the STAR format: situation, task, action, and results. And this is sort of highlighted to show you where those come into play. So in the yellow, talks about the situation, task, the blue talks about the action, and then the green is the results. So for this one, you can see here, this person was a financial intern at BMO. They worked with corporate clients, and one of the duties was to develop a workshop and to deliver the workshop to people. Now, if you just take out the results, it sounds okay, but it doesn't sound amazing in the sense that I could say this on my cover letter. But what really makes this different is the results. And it's actually a really impressive result that because of these workshops, the head office was so impressed that they actually made this workshop to roll it out to multiple branches across the city or across the country, whatever it is. They actually used the workshop for other places. So not only was this student able to attract new clients for that specific branch, they were also able to create a workshop that is now being rolled out across multiple branches. And that's impressive. And that really, I think for this paragraph, that's what really makes this compelling for an employer to read. And generally the cover letter, it's 1 page maximum. So keeping that in mind, you don't want to go beyond a page.
I was raising my
hand. Yep, go ahead.
We've heard that resumes, like the people that are hiring, they just read those for a few seconds. They just glance through them. So for the cover letter, do they do the same? Do they really read the full cover letter, or they just kind of glance through it?
It will depend. Some people will read it, other people will just glance through it. Other people might just look for keywords that pop up for them. So it really depends on the employer. So it's not a great answer, but like, again, because they're people, it's all going to be different. Some people read the resume first, other people read the cover letter first. So because of that, you want to make sure that your resume and your cover letter are both really good. But again, similar to the resume, you also want to be concise with the cover letter. So don't be too wordy, and you don't want to be too long. So you don't want the letter to take up the entire piece of paper, because then it's just overwhelming. So here's some examples of what a cover letter could look like. So there's 2 paragraphs in the middle, introduction, conclusion. So it's not overly long. And then you can see on the resume how the headers, they're not exactly the same, but they're similar. So these examples I will attach in an email afterwards so you can see them, so I can actually read what's on them. Before we move on to the next step, so the very last bit of the session, I would really appreciate being able to to fill an evaluation for this workshop. It takes quick, 2 to 5 minutes maximum, if not less. And it just provides feedback in terms of, did you learn what you were hoping to get from the session? And what kind of things did you learn, and what kind of things would you hope to learn in the future? So it helps us fine tune the session for future students and for future semesters. If you do submit an evaluation, you are put into a draw for one of 2 $50 gift cards of your choice. So yeah, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, or you can either unmute yourself and then ask them. So Jason, does Vic, do you have a template for resumes and CVs? We do not, because resumes and CVs and also cover letters can all look very different. So if you just search up resume templates or cover letter templates or CV templates, you'll see a ton, and that can give you some idea of how you want your resume to look. So there's tons if you Google resumes and cover letters and formats and whatnot. One thing I should just brought up, one thing that this question brings up for me is resumes and CVs, the differences between resumes and CVs. CVs are more for when you apply for grad school or when you apply for academic positions, so like a professor, for example. And generally CVs are much longer. It's more focused on education and research. So it's different than a resume, because a resume is more focused on sort of professional work and applying for jobs, 1 or 2 pages maximum. CV does not have a page limit. So if you look up your professor's CVs, for example, they may go on for like 20, 30 pages, because they'll list all their publications, they list all of their presentations, they list all of their teaching, the courses that they taught. So it goes for at length, really long. So that's sort of the key difference between a resume and CV, whereas CV is more for academia, focused on research, focused on awards, scholarships, and focus on your research output, whereas this resume is more focused on those skills that are required from the job that you're applying for. All right, so next steps. So in terms of thinking about your own resumes and cover letters, there's multiple ways you can start going for like one small step forward. It could be around starting to analyze job postings you want to apply for now and getting a sense of what are those key skills. You can continue writing those accomplishment statements. And if you want to, feel free to share your email or your contact information with the people who were in your group or earlier this session. And that way, maybe you can sort of bounce ideas off of each other and see whether your statements make sense or whether or not they're impressive. When you're writing those bullet points, think of the STAR format, so situation, task, action, results. You can also format your resume and your cover letter if you want to do that. So looking up templates on Google and whatnot. And you can also set up a one-on-one advising appointment with me. So if you want more tailored help with your resume or your cover letter, feel free to set up an appointment with myself, and I'm more than happy to chat with you about that. And sometimes it is difficult when you write those statements. It can sound really wordy or sound a little like you're bragging a bit, and that's okay. So for example, this meme here, like, how do you write change a light bulb on your resume? One person said, single-handedly managed the successful upgrade and deployment of new environmental illumination system with 0 cost overruns and 0 safety incidents. So that sounds a lot more impressive than changing a light bulb. So you can see where the difference is there when you write those accomplishment statements. All right, so I'm gonna do one more poll just to see where people are at. So when you think about writing your cover letter resumes now, how confident are you currently in writing that resume and writing that cover letter? All right, so just show the results. So there's a shift. So see that no one's now thinking that they're not at all confident. People are moving more to somewhat confident and confident. And with resumes and cover letters, you will become more confident as you do more of them. So the first couple are going to be a struggle for some. It may feel like it's torture. That's normal. As you get to write more resumes and more cover letters, then you feel more confident and sort of know what to write and what to include to tailor your resumes and cover letters. So it really comes with practice, I would say. And that is it. So thank you all for coming. If you want to book an appointment with me, you can feel free to send me an email, or you can go to the website there to book an appointment. I'm available for one-on-one advising Monday to Friday. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I'll stick around for a little bit. But again, thank you so much for joining me on a Friday. And I hope you all have a great weekend and a great reading break.